The government has a lot of different ways to try to diminish or even lessen the impact of freedom of speech. That being censoring the people who have breached those untold laws and restrictions. The government permits that some ways of speech are censored uh, or restricted, whether that be art, writing, speaking, or even ideas and beliefs that are viewed to be problematic. The content and context of the speech being practiced will permit the government the government's involvement. One factor that permits particular speech restrictions is the incitement of imminent violence. So the Supreme Court looks at five major categories um, that permit restrictions that being what is said, how it is said, the place the place where it is said, and the speaker themselves, and also the types of regulation. The Supreme Court also rejects the idea freedom of speech is a prerequisite of of the First Amendment. So a major category which would go into restricting certain types of speech and certain types of art um, would be obscenity. Um, so that being um, impacting the government uh, by showing sexual content, and that sort of implements the government's involvement. So, for example, a big reason why the government has certain restrictions and gives certain restrictions to certain art forms or certain forms of writing is because you know is because in a sense of we look at the rated R's in movies, and the rated M's in video games and all those other things. It's the government's way in restricting that specific art form to a specific audience, that being children. So the reason why that movie is rated R is because of sexual content, is because of violence, is because of sexual violence. Yeah, that's another one that can apply. So there are various terms of the government getting involved in certain types of speech, and sort of restricting it or censoring it, and making it sort of just completely just illegal to a certain specific type of audience. Not every audience, a specific type of audience. Um, and in a way, does it impact our freedom of speech? In a certain way, kind of, because when you look at that sort of aspect of things, um, you know, freedom is not for everybody. The idea of watching an R-rated film, that's not for everybody. So the idea of that R-rated film, there are certain types of audiences, specifically kids, that are not allowed to watch that certain film because the government says this is going to be too much for kids to handle. This is going to be too violent or too sexual or too mature for these kids to handle. And that's why those restrictions are held in place. So, in conclusion, the diminishing impact on certain restrictions and that are also put into our rights um, of freedom of speech is very interesting. And the main idea of freedom of speech is everything can be said, but in reality, there are some restrictions that are implemented into our culture. Um, so where some aspects of speech can be unacceptable to the government.